The last sound before everything changed was rain. Not real rain. A recording. Corporal Isildarro kept a small audio file on her personal device, 2 minutes and 14 seconds of rain falling on a tin roof somewhere in rural Portugal, recorded by her grandmother 40 years ago. She played it every night before her shift because deep space made no sound at all, and silence, after long enough, started to feel like something was wrong. She was 3 weeks into her rotation at Frontier Post Aldis, a monitoring station bolted to the dark side of a dead moon at the far edge of the exclusion belt. The post had a crew of 9. Their job was simple: watch the beacons, log the readings, report anything unusual. In the last 4 decades, nothing unusual had ever happened at Aldis. The previous crew had spent their entire rotation cataloging mineral deposits on the moon's surface just to have something to do. Isil finished her rain recording and walked to her station. The long-range array was already running its nightly sweep, green lights across the board. She pulled up the beacon status. All 17 beacons along Line 7 were transmitting normally, broadcasting in 47 languages in every direction. Do not enter. Turn back. This is your only warning. The messages had been cycling for so long that the hardware had worn grooves into its own relay patterns. Nobody ever responded. Nobody ever came. She poured herself something warm from the kitchen unit and sat down with a technical report she had been meaning to read for 6 days. She got through 2 paragraphs before the long-range array made a sound she had never heard before. It was not an alarm. It was quieter than that. A soft, repeating tone, the array's way of saying it had found something large enough to flag, but was still trying to determine exactly what it was. Isil set down her drink and leaned forward. The screen was showing a cluster of signatures, not one, not a scout. A formation tight, organized, moving at a speed that suggested military-grade propulsion. The array was still counting. She watched the number climb, 40, 60, 80. It stopped at 112. 112 vessels, capital class, moving in a direct line through Beacon Line 7. Isil sat very still for a moment. Then she ran the identification protocol. The hull pattern recognition software needed 11 seconds. When it returned a result, the word it displayed was one she recognized from briefings but had never expected to see on an active screen: Veldrani. She sent the standard warning sequence immediately. Automated, calm, transmitted in Veldrani first and then in 46 other languages. The beacon system picked up her transmission and amplified it across the entire line. She watched the signal travel out on her screen, a thin line reaching toward those 112 dots. The fleet did not slow. She transmitted again. This time she added a personal rider to the automated message, a direct channel, open, no encryption. She identified herself, identified the post, identified the Saul Doctrine by its full legal designation. She explained in plain language that they had crossed into sovereign human space and were required by interstellar agreement to reverse course immediately. The fleet transmitted back. It was not a voice. It was a symbol, the colonial authority seal of the Veldrani ascendancy, which meant they were claiming the right to settle. They were not here to fight. They were here to build. As if the exclusion belt were empty land waiting for someone to want it badly enough. Isil looked at the symbol for a few seconds. Then she pulled up the escalation protocol and began typing the alert that would go to Admiral Reina Solis and Director Oscar Havel. She included the fleet count, the identification, the trajectory, the time of first contact, and the content of the Veldrani response. She marked it Priority 1, which she had never marked anything in her life. Before she sent it, she added a single line at the bottom, not official, not part of the protocol. She just could not help it. It said, "They actually came." She sent the alert. On the Veldrani flagship, 8 light minutes away, Commander Orvin stood at the navigation display and watched the warning beacon slide past on either side of the formation. His navigator asked if they should log the transmission from the human post. Orvin said yes. His second officer asked if they should respond more formally. Orvin said they already had. High Sovereign Vareth had given the order 3 months ago. The fleet had trained for 2 years before that. The colonization ships were full: engineers, families, agricultural teams, teachers. 12,000 Veldrani who had been told they were going to build something new. Orvin watched the beacons recede behind them and said nothing. He had read some things about humans in old reports that he had not shared with anyone. He told himself he would raise those concerns at the appropriate time. The appropriate time had already passed. Back at Frontier Post Aldi's, Isildaro watched the confirmation light blink on her screen, telling her the alert had been received. Then she opened her personal log and recorded a short entry. She said that she did not know exactly what was going to happen next, but she was fairly certain that 112 ships had just made the most expensive mistake in the history of the Veldrani ascendancy. She said she hoped it would end cleanly. She said she was going to finish her drink. Then she closed the log and went back to watching the screen, because that was her job, and she was going to do it right until someone told her otherwise. The rain recording had ended a long time ago. She did not notice. The Veldrani had a word for the moment when a plan stops being a plan and becomes a problem. There was no exact translation in any human language, but the closest version was something like, "the point of too much forward." Director Oscar Havel thought about that word as he read Isildaro's alert for the 3rd time. He was not a military man. He had spent 30 years inside the machinery of the Sol Doctrine, treaties, amendments, language revisions, diplomatic protocols so layered and precise that most species in the Galactic Concord found them exhausting to read. He had always believed that the doctrine's real strength was not the fleet behind it. It was the clarity of it. The warning was simple. The consequence was stated. There was nothing to misunderstand. And yet here was a fleet of 112 ships that had apparently decided to misunderstand anyway. He sent 2 messages within the first hour. The first went to Envoy Dara Nkosi at the Galactic Concord Station, flagged urgent. The second went to Admiral Reyna Solis, flagged routine, because Solis had told him years ago that she did not need urgency flags to move fast, and that routine markings drew less attention from anyone watching traffic patterns. Then he waited, which was the part of his job he had never learned to do comfortably. Dara Nkosi received his message while she was in a side corridor of the Concord station, between sessions of a trade negotiation that had been running for 3 weeks and would probably run for 3 more. She read the alert once and then walked directly to the emergency session request desk, which had never in her career been used for an actual emergency. The Concord chamber filled within 2 hours. That alone was unusual. Normally it took days to assemble a full session. Delegates had schedules. Their governments needed time to send instructions. There were protocols for protocols. But the word Veldrani and the phrase exclusion belt had traveled fast, and every species with a border anywhere near the ascendancy had apparently decided their schedule was suddenly clear. The chamber was loud in a way that Dara had learned to read over the years. There was the loud of genuine alarm, which sounded disorganized and high-pitched. There was the loud of political performance, which sounded confident and slightly too coordinated. What she heard now was something in between: species who were genuinely frightened, but were also watching each other very carefully to see how frightened everyone else was planning to admit to being. She let them talk for 40 minutes, then she took the floor. She did not raise her voice. She had learned that a quiet voice in a loud room made people stop and pay attention faster than any amount of shouting. She laid out the facts: the fleet count, the classification, the trajectory, the Sol Doctrine article being violated, and the timeline. She did not editorialize. She did not use emotional language. She simply described what had happened as if she were reading a weather report. The chamber got quieter as she went. When she finished, 3 delegates spoke at once, which the chair allowed because the chair was also rattled. The Grethani delegate, a species with 6 separate trade routes passing through Veldrani space, wanted to know if humanity had responded militarily yet. The Solvari delegate wanted to know if the Veldrani could be reasoned with. The Tirani delegate, who had not spoken at a public session in 11 years, simply said that they had always thought this would happen eventually, and that the conquered had been warned. Nobody asked what the humans were going to do. Dara noticed that. They all knew what the humans were going to do. What they wanted to know was how much of it they would have to watch. Havel called her 3 hours into the session. He told her something that he had not put in the official message. The fleet, he said, had already been repositioning for 18 hours. Not because anyone had ordered it. The repositioning was part of an automated contingency plan that activated the moment. A formation of more than 50 vessels was detected moving through any beacon line. The military did not need to be told. The military had already written the response before the situation existed. Dara absorbed this and asked how long she had. Havel told her 72 hours before the authorization threshold was crossed and Solis received operational freedom. He said this carefully, which meant he was also saying, "Do what you can, but understand what we are actually talking about here." She went back into the chamber and pushed for a formal resolution condemning the incursion. It took 6 hours and 14 rounds of language revision, because 3 delegates wanted stronger phrasing, and 2 delegates wanted weaker phrasing, and 1 delegate wanted to include a clause about their own unrelated territorial dispute. She removed that clause 4 times. It kept coming back. The resolution passed with 23 votes in favor, 2 abstentions, and 1 delegate from a small outer system who had fallen asleep and missed the vote entirely. It was a meaningless document. It had no enforcement mechanism. The Veldrani were not members of the Conquered in any binding capacity and had no obligation to read it. Dara knew this. The delegates knew this. The Grethani delegate caught her eye as the vote was announced and gave a gesture in their language that roughly translated to, "We did what we could." She transmitted the resolution to Havel. Then she sent him a second message, encrypted, separate, 2 words only. "Clock's running." Havel read it at his desk alone with the lights low. He folded his hands and looked at the ceiling for a while. Outside his window, through the transparent aluminum and the dark, a shuttle was making its slow way toward the orbital dock. Normal traffic. Normal day for someone. He hoped the Veldrani had someone somewhere who was as worried as he was. He hoped that person had some influence. He had no way of knowing. That was the part that kept him sitting in the dark long after he should have gone to sleep. Somewhere far behind the beacon line, the fleet moved on. There was a game the Veldrani played with their children to teach them about history. 2 players sat across from each other. One held a stone. The other held nothing. The one with nothing had to convince the one with the stone to give it up, using only words, only logic, only truth. The one with the stone always won. The lesson was supposed to be about strength. Commander Orvin had loved that game as a child. He was thinking about it now, alone in his quarters on the 12th night of the fleet's transit, and for the first time he was wondering if he had ever understood the lesson correctly. He had pulled the archive files 3 days ago. They had been sitting in the Ascendancy's intelligence library for years, filed under a category that translated roughly as exaggerated historical claims, a label applied by someone who had clearly not read them. He read them now. The first file covered the Dravathi hegemony's first contact with humanity, 260 years ago. The Dravathi had been a serious military power. Their fleet at the time of contact numbered over 400 vessels. They had faster-than-light capability, energy shielding, and a strong tradition of expansion. When they found a human colony ship operating in what they considered their exploration zone, they sent a destroyer to intercept it. The destroyer did not return. They sent 6 more. None returned. They sent a full battle group of 40 ships. It was destroyed in a single engagement that lasted less than 3 hours. The Dravathi High Command reviewed the sensor records and concluded that the humans had used some kind of experimental weapon and would likely not be able to replicate it. They sent 180 ships. That engagement lasted 6 hours. The Dravathi lost all 180 vessels. Human casualties in that battle numbered 31. 31. Orvin read that number 4 times. He had assumed the record was corrupted. He searched for a corrected version. There was no corrected version. The number appeared in 3 separate accounts, 2 of them Dravathi primary sources, and 1 a human after-action report written in the kind of flat, administrative language that people use when they are describing something so one-sided that drama would feel dishonest. He kept reading. The second file covered something that the intelligence briefings had mentioned only in passing and then moved away from quickly: the Pact of Restraint. It was a human internal document, not a treaty with any other species. Humanity had written it and signed it themselves, 30 years after the Dravathi conflict, after 2 more species had made similar mistakes and received similar outcomes. The pact was a list of things humanity agreed not to do in any future conflict, unless the survival of the human species itself was at stake. Orvin read the list slowly. It was long. Some items were technical, and he did not fully understand them. Others were clear enough. There was a category of weapon humanity had developed that could affect the structural integrity of a star. They had agreed not to use it. There was a method of biological disruption that could render a species unable to reproduce for 3 generations. They had agreed not to use it. There was a communication-based attack capable of permanently degrading a species' collective decision-making capacity at a neurological level. They had agreed not to use it. The list went on for 11 pages. At the bottom, there was a single line that was not part of the official document. Someone, at some point, had added a handwritten note in the margin of the archived copy. It said, "We wrote this because we could do all of it. We wrote this because we decided we shouldn't." Orvin closed the file. He sat in the dark for a long time. Then he composed a report to High Sovereign Vareth. He wrote carefully, without alarm in his language, because Vareth did not respond well to what he called emotional framing. He presented the archival data. He presented the 31 figure. He presented the Pact of Restraint. He recommended, in formal military language, an immediate and full withdrawal of the fleet, combined with a diplomatic approach through the Galactic Concord offering reparations, territorial acknowledgement, and a formal apology addressed directly to the Sol Doctrine Authority. He encrypted the message at the highest level and sent it through the secure relay. Then he walked the length of his flagship. It took 20 minutes at a moderate pace. The ship was enormous, designed for long-range colonization support as much as combat. As he walked the inner corridors, he passed through the civilian sections. The colonization quarters were quieter at this hour. Families were sleeping in small units behind gray doors. He could hear faintly the sounds of children, a cough, someone's music playing low. 12,000 people, engineers who had left their jobs, teachers who had packed their personal libraries into storage containers, farmers who had brought seed stock for crops they expected to grow under a new sun. None of them had asked to be inside a human military exclusion zone. They had been told they were going somewhere new. They had believed it. Orvin stood in the corridor for a while and listened to the quiet sounds of people sleeping and did not move. The response from Vareth came 18 hours later. It was 3 words, stamped with the High Sovereign's personal seal. "Hold the course." Orvin read it once, deleted the message, walked back to the archive files. He did not know yet what he was going to do. He knew that he was going to do something. The game with the stone, he thought, only made sense if the one with nothing was also willing to simply walk away. He wondered if he still could. Outside the hull. In the dark, the human monitoring buoys drifted silently past. Every one of them was functioning perfectly. Every one of them was watching. There is a particular kind of silence that only happens in space, and most species who travel between stars get used to it. But there is a different silence, the kind that follows a thing you did not expect, and that silence feels different in every language, in every body, in every mind that has ever made a mistake it cannot take back. The Veldrani fleet had been inside the exclusion belt for 11 days when the second kind of silence arrived. It did not arrive loudly. That was the part Orvin would remember most. There was no warning flash, no countdown, no dramatic transmission cutting across the comm channels with music or ceremony. One moment his sensors showed open space around the fleet. The next moment the sensors showed something else entirely. 209 human warships, present, surrounding, waiting. They had not jumped in from a distance. They had simply become visible, all of them at the same instant, as if a switch had been thrown. Later, Orvin's sensor chief would try to explain the technical method and would not be able to. The human vessels had been running some form of passive concealment so complete that the fleet's instruments had read them as background space for days. They had been there the whole time, watching, counting, getting into position. The formation was geometric and exact, a complete sphere around the Veldrani fleet, spaced at intervals that his tactical officer immediately identified as optimized firing solutions. Every single Veldrani ship was inside at least 3 overlapping targeting zones. Not 2, not 1, 3, minimum. His second officer, Sira, looked at the display and then looked at him and did not speak. The communication request came in 6 seconds after the decloaking. It was addressed to his vessel specifically, not to the flagship, not to the fleet-wide channel, but to the Ascendant Will, his ship, by name. The signal carried a formal Sol Doctrine identifier and requested a direct channel with the ranking military officer aboard. He accepted it. Admiral Reyna Soli spoke in Veldrani, not translated Veldrani, not software-assisted Veldrani. Fluent, accented correctly, with the formal register used between military officers of equal rank, a register that the Veldrani themselves only used in situations of great seriousness. She said his rank, his name, and the name of his ship. Then she told him the following things. She told him the count of his vessels, 112. She told him the count of hers, 209, plus deep-range platforms at coordinates she did not specify. She told him how many days the fleet had been inside the exclusion belt. She told him the Sol Doctrine article number that had been violated. She told him the number of formal warnings transmitted, starting from beacon line 7 and including every subsequent automated beacon his fleet had passed. She was not angry. Her voice was the same temperature throughout, level, clear, unhurried. Then she said, "You will not be inside our space for a 12th day." That was all. The channel stayed open, but she said nothing further. She was giving him time to think. Orvin understood, with a precision that felt almost physical, that this was the only time he was going to be given. He was still composing his response in his head when a second signal arrived on an entirely separate channel, encrypted, addressed directly to him personally, not to his rank, not to his ship, but to his name. He almost did not open it. He opened it. It contained one document, the Pact of Restraint, the same file he had found in the archive, but this copy had one page bookmarked, the list of capabilities humanity had agreed not to deploy unless existential circumstances required it. The bookmark had a note attached, 3 words in standard trade script, "You already know." Someone on the human side had been watching him access the archive files. They had let him read. They had waited 11 days, and now they were telling him privately, before anything else happened, that there was a version of this situation where the fleet did not have to become a footnote in the same category as the Dravathi hegemony. Sira was watching him. She had seen both signals arrive. She said nothing. On the Veldrani flagship, Vareth's override command was already being transmitted. Engage. Full formation advance. The colonization fleet would push through and the warships would clear a path, and the ascendancy would demonstrate that the Saul doctrine was a historical relic that no longer reflected the true balance of power in this region of space. The override arrived at Orvan's relay, and he looked at it. He thought about the game with the stone. He thought about the 31. He thought about the 11 pages of things humanity had decided not to do. He thought about the families sleeping 2 corridors behind him, and the teachers, and the seed stock for crops that were never going to be planted in this system. He locked Vareth out of the Ascendant Will's command relay. It took 4 keystrokes. He used the emergency command authority that existed in Veldrani military law for situations where a superior officer's order would result in certain and total destruction of forces under the commanding officer's direct charge. He had never used it. He was not certain anyone had ever used it in this context. He used it anyway. Then he opened the fleet-wide channel and broadcast surrender. Full, unconditional in Veldrani and in standard trade script, and in the formal Saul doctrine surrender language that his ships had been required to have loaded in their systems as a condition of operating anywhere near human space. 3 of his captains brought weapons online anyway. Their ships went dark before a single targeting solution was completed. No explosion, no fire. The lights went out and the vessels drifted, and that was all. Isildaro, now stationed on one of the surrounding human vessels, was running translations of the Veldrani internal comm traffic when the surrender broadcast came through. She flagged it immediately and passed it to her superior officer. Then she sat back in her chair and let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 11 days. She made a note in her log. Their commander just saved 12,000 lives, including his own. I want to remember that he did that. On the Ascendant Will, Orvan opened the channel to Admiral Solis and offered formal unconditional surrender. His hands were steady. He was not sure why. He had expected his hands to shake. Solis accepted. Then she asked him for the civilian manifest of everyone aboard the colonization ships. She was already working on logistics. Orvan understood that too. The stone, he thought, had always been a poor way to teach the lesson. What the Galactic Conquered observed through the relay feeds that day was not what most of them had expected to see. They had expected fire. Every major conflict in recorded interstellar history had involved fire, energy discharge, hull ruptures, the bright and terrible grammar of one civilization trying to end another. They had positioned relay probes along the edge of the exclusion belt specifically to capture the engagement, because the Conquered's Historical Archive Division had requested documentation, and because several delegates privately had wanted to see what humanity actually did when pushed. What they saw was this: 112 Veldrani vessels surrounded by 209 human warships, 3 Veldrani ships attempting to bring weapon systems online. Those 3 ships losing all power in the same second, not destroyed, not burning, simply dark, like someone had reached in and removed the electricity from them with a thumb and forefinger. Then a fleet-wide surrender broadcast from the Veldrani commander. Then, over the next 4 minutes and 22 seconds, every remaining Veldrani warship losing propulsion and weapons capability, in a sequence so controlled and so fast that the Conquered's automated analysis system flagged the data 3 times as potentially corrupted, because the timing intervals were too precise to appear natural. 4 minutes and 22 seconds, 112 ships. Nobody fired a weapon. Nobody was destroyed. The human fleet had disabled the entire Veldrani formation the way a person might turn off lights in a room they were leaving methodically, without drama, without waste. The Conquered observer, who had spent 60 years covering alien conflicts, sent her editors a message that was later read into the formal record. She wrote that she had seen 8 wars and 19 military incidents, and had always believed that what distinguished a powerful civilization from a dangerous one was the ability to choose restraint. She wrote that she understood now that she had been watching civilizations choose restraint because they had to. She had never, until today, seen a civilization choose restraint because they so clearly did not have to. On the Ascendant Will, Orvin was on an open channel with Admiral Solis working through the civilian manifest. She had already dispatched 3 medical vessels to the colonization fleet. They arrived faster than the Veldrani emergency systems could have managed. The human ships were smaller than the colonization transports, but better equipped, and they docked with an efficiency that suggested they had trained for exactly this scenario. Solis' logistics coordinator was asking Orvin detailed questions. How many medical cases? How many children under 5? How many individuals with existing health conditions? What was the food supply status on each colonization vessel? Were any of the ships running on backup power? The questions were not hostile. They were the questions of someone who was already solving a problem and needed data to solve it faster. Orvin answered all of them. At some point in the middle of this process, his second officer Sira touched his arm and pointed at a secondary screen. It showed the power status of his own ship. The human fleet could have cut it at any point. They had not. The Ascendant Will still had full power, full life support, full internal communications. He was not being punished. He was being differentiated. He had made a choice. They had noticed. High Sovereign Vareth on the Veldrani homeworld received the news in stages. First the lockout of his command relay, then the surrender broadcast, then the disabling of the fleet, then the visual confirmation from the relay probes. He had been awake for 19 hours by the time the full picture arrived. His advisors stood in a line at the far end of the chamber and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that Vareth would want to hear. He issued a statement declaring Orvin a traitor. The statement was transmitted. It reached the conquered relay. Dara Nkosi read it, noted it, and filed it in a folder she labeled things that will not matter in 6 months. On a human medical vessel now docked to the colonization transport carrying the largest number of civilians, Isildaro was part of the boarding team. She had been reassigned from communications to civilian processing, because she spoke a functional level of Veldrani. She had learned it 2 years ago as a side project because deep space posting left a great deal of time to fill. Her accent was poor, and her vocabulary was limited to practical subjects, but she could ask someone if they were hurt and understand the answer, and right now that was the most useful skill on the ship. The corridor inside the colonization transport smelled like recycled air, and something faintly herbal, a plant the Veldrani carried with them, she was told later, because the scent was associated with home. The lights were dimmer than she was used to. The ceiling was lower. Everything was sized and shaped for a people who were slightly shorter and wider than humans, and walking through the space felt like being in a building that had been designed by someone who had heard of humans but never met one. A child was standing alone in the corridor. Small, dark-eyed, wearing a gray suit with a small emblem on the chest, a family symbol, she guessed. The child was staring at her with the absolute focus that young children sometimes use when they are deciding whether to be frightened. Isil stopped. She did not move toward the child. She had learned enough about Veldrani body language to know that direct forward movement read as aggressive. She stood still and let the child look at her. Then she smiled. The child stared at the smile for a long time. The Veldrani did not smile. Their facial muscles did not work that way, and the expression meant nothing in their culture. But the child was young and had the particular open curiosity of someone who had not yet been taught what to dismiss. After a long pause, the child attempted something with its face, not quite the same shape as a smile, the muscles not quite capable of it, but the effort unmistakably present. Isil recorded a short personal note right there in the corridor. She said, "I don't know how this will be written in the history files. I know there are 12,000 people on these ships who had nothing to do with the decision that brought them here. I know Orvin made a choice and it cost him something. I know Solis could have done more and chose not to. I know that child has a family somewhere in this ship who are scared." She paused the recording, started it again. She said, "We're still here, so are they. Somebody made that happen, I'll take it." She ended the recording and went back to work. 2 years later, a Veldrani child learned to draw a circle. It was not the most significant thing that happened in those 2 years. There were formal hearings at the Galactic Concord. There were reparation negotiations that lasted 11 months and involved language specialists from 6 different species, because the Veldrani legal tradition and the Saul Doctrine enforcement framework had been built from completely different assumptions about what justice meant. There was the removal of High Sovereign Vareth by the Veldrani Senate, which happened quietly, without a public announcement, in the way that powerful old men are sometimes removed when what they have cost becomes undeniable. There was the re-ratification of the Saul Doctrine with 4 new signatories who had previously declined to sign and had now reconsidered their position. All of that happened, but the child learning to draw a circle was the thing that Isildaro mentioned in her testimony, and it was the detail that the Concord Observer included in the first paragraph of her published account, because it was the detail that felt true in a way that formal records sometimes did not. The child's name was Vesey. She was 6 years old and had been aboard the colonization transport for the entire transit, sleeping in a small bunk in a family Unit 3 corridors from where Isil had first seen her. In the 2 years since, she had been enrolled in a youth exchange program on a neutral station, one of several initiatives that came out of the reparation framework, and that most delegates had voted for without expecting much to come of them. The program paired Veldrani children from the colonization fleet with human educational volunteers, on the theory that if the situation was ever going to mean something beyond the legal record, it needed to start somewhere young. Isil was one of the volunteers. She went twice a month. The circle she taught Vesey to draw was part of a simple geometry lesson, and Vesey's circle was not very good, lopsided on one side, the line thick where her hand had pressed too hard. But she had held up the paper and looked at it with the expression that children use when they have made something and are deciding if it is worth being proud of, and then she had decided that it was, and Isil had agreed with her. None of that was in the formal record. The formal record was long and dense and would not have mentioned circles at all. At the Galactic Concord hearing, Commander Orvin testified for 3 days. He had been stripped of rank by the Veldrani military and was living in diplomatic holding on a neutral station, which was not comfortable but was significantly better than the alternative. He was calm throughout the testimony, answering questions in a direct and detailed way that the Concord delegates found unusual because most witnesses in proceedings like this tried to minimize or qualify everything. Orvin minimized nothing. He described what he had found in the archive. He described the moment he read the 31 figure. He described the 11 pages of the Pact of Restraint. When a delegate from the Grethani asked him to read the pact aloud for the record, he did, in a flat voice, going through each item on the list without emphasis or editorializing, and the chamber was silent in a way that only happens when a large group of intelligent beings is absorbing something simultaneously. When he finished reading, the Tirani delegate, who had not spoken publicly at a session in over 11 years, asked Orvin one question. He asked, "When you read the pact for the first time alone on your ship, what did you feel?" Orvin thought about it for a long moment. Then he said, "I felt the distance between what I had been told and what was true, and I understood that the distance was the whole problem." Dara Nkosi delivered humanity's formal statement on the last day of the hearing. It was short, a single page, which she read without notes. It traced the history of the Saul Doctrine from the first Dravathi contact to the present. It did not gloat. It did not describe the engagement with the Veldrani fleet in dramatic terms. It described it the way Solis' crew had executed it, without drama and without waste. The last paragraph was the one that the Concord Observer quoted in her account, and that was later reproduced, without permission, on approximately 900 separate platforms across the known galaxy within 48 hours of its delivery. Dara Nkosi said, "The warning is not a threat. A threat tells you what we want to do. The warning tells you what we have decided not to do, and what we will do if you do not allow us that choice. We did not build the exclusion belt because we are afraid of what is outside it. We built it because we remember what happened when we were not careful about what we let ourselves become. She paused. The chamber was very quiet. She said, "The belt stays, the warnings stay, and we will be here behind them for as long as there are stars." Admiral Reyna Solis retired 6 months after the hearing. In her last interview, a reporter asked her what she had felt during the engagement, the 4 minutes and 22 seconds. She took her time with the answer. She said she had felt tired. She said that every time she had to demonstrate what the fleet could do, she felt tired afterward in a way that took longer to recover from than it used to. She said she had thought about the circle of ships and the 112 vessels and the 12,000 people and the child that Issel had mentioned in her report, and she had thought, "None of you had to be here." The reporter asked if she was proud of what the fleet had accomplished. Solis thought about it. She said, "I am proud of what we chose not to do." On the edge of the exclusion belt, 6 months after the hearing, a new beacon was installed to replace the one that had been damaged when the Veldrani fleet passed through. Issel Darrow, now a lieutenant, pressed the activation key herself. She had requested the assignment specifically. The beacon ran its calibration cycle and began to broadcast. The message was the same as it had always been, 47 languages, patient, clear, stating the same thing it had always stated. The Void received it the way the Void receives everything, without comment, without judgment, without confirmation. Issel stood at the console for a moment after the activation was confirmed. She thought about Vesi's lopsided circle. She thought about Orvan's voice reading 11 pages in a quiet hearing room. She thought about her grandmother's rain recording, and how sometimes the right sound in the right silence was the only thing that reminded you that somewhere there was still something worth going home to. Then she filed the activation report and went back to her station. The beacon kept talking to the dark. It had always been enough.